Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, the only channel where sleepless nights aren't cured by chamomile tea, but by imagining yourself half naked in a steaming room filled with sweaty senators, communal oils, and something suspicious floating in the corner. Tonight's lesson in regret? The Roman Bathhouse. That luxurious marvel of ancient civilization. Marble floors, arched ceilings, and an odour that could drop a centurion at 10 paces. You think you'd survive a dip in this ancient wellness centre? Think again, because behind the elegance lies a daily ritual soaked in bacteria, body odour, class warfare, and things best left undescribed. So loosen your toga. You'll be losing your dignity soon enough. Let's begin where every Roman did, with oil. No soaps, no bubble baths, no lavender-scented foams, just oil. Thick, sticky olive oil, slathered across your body by some overworked, underpaid, possibly lice-infested slave boy who hasn't bathed himself in 3 days. You'd rub it in and let it mingle with the sweat, grime and dead skin you'd collected throughout the day. From walking the dusty streets of Rome to sitting in the forum pretending to be more important than you are. And when you were nice and greasy, you'd hand over the strigel. Ah yes, the strigel. A curved bronze blade, roughly the size of a dinner knife, designed to scrape that oily, disgusting mixture off your skin in long, satisfying strokes. Except there's nothing satisfying about sharing that same tool with a dozen other men who haven't heard of infectious disease theory. Imagine a gym locker room, but with fewer rules, no soap, and communal skin scrapings. Meet Gaius, a mid-level clerk in the grain office. Not important enough for the best masseur, but just important enough to get a seat near the warm bench. He starts every day with a good oiling, lets it bake into his pores under the sun, then makes his way to the thermopolium for a questionable snack of lukewarm meat. Then it's off to the bathhouse. Because in Rome, hygiene is a social activity. As Gaius strips down, he watches men of all sizes do the same. Senators, merchants, philosophers, all naked, all sweating, all pretending not to judge each other's body hair distribution. And you, dear modern viewer, with your bottle of hand sanitizer and modesty, wouldn't last 5 minutes. Let's talk about the sponge on a stick. A delightful invention used for, shall we say, personal cleaning after a visit to the latrine. In many bathhouses, that same sponge made its way into cleaning routines, rinsed in a bucket of vinegar and hope. If you're lucky, the guy before you didn't have dysentery. And don't even think about privacy. Bathhouses weren't designed for solitude. They were places of conversation, politics, gossip, and the occasional awkward eye contact. Imagine you're sitting in a hot tub and suddenly a senator plops down beside you and starts ranting about grain tariffs. No headphones, no escape, just sweat and senatorial breath. Now here's a fun fact. The bathhouse was one of the few places where class lines blurred. Sort of. Yes, slaves could bathe. Yes, free citizens and aristocrats all entered the same complex. But not at the same time. Entry was staggered by social status, and if you stayed too long, you risked overlapping with those people. You know, the poor, or worse, the poets. Let's add in some heat. The caldarium, or hot room, was heated by an underfloor furnace called a hypercaust, which sounds fancy, until you realize that slaves had to shovel wood and coal for hours to keep it running. They'd crawl beneath the floors in cramped tunnels, choking on smoke, just so Gaius could sweat out his sins. Think of it as an ancient sauna with a body count. And speaking of sweat, there's no draining system like you're imagining. The hot room floors collected a stew of oil, perspiration, and foot fungus, occasionally drained by a lazy channel leading somewhere. Not cleaned daily, not even weekly. If you slipped, you didn't just risk a sprain, you risked tetanus and a lifetime of regret. Bathhouses were also home to disease. Not metaphorical diseases like vanity or lust, real ones. Tuberculosis was fond of the warm, damp air. Ringworm thrived in shared sandals. And pubic lice? They were the real citizens of Rome, migrating from man to man with a speed that would impress any modern epidemiologist. Even your towel, known as a sudarium, was a status symbol, if you had one. Most men didn't. They dried themselves in the open air or used the backs of their slaves. The more luxurious option was to rent one from the bathhouse attendant. Shared, damp, slightly fragrant, probably used to clean benches. Let's go back to our friend Gaius. After scraping himself clean and stepping over the man who just passed out in the heat, he makes his way to the tepidarium, the warm room. There he reclines against the wall and listens to two elderly men argue about whether Neptune is angry again. He pretends to care, but really he's thinking about the girl he saw yesterday in the appetiterium, the changing room, as she slipped into her linen shift. Because yes, sometimes men and women bathed at the same time, or at least used the same facilities an hour apart, separated by a curtain and Roman denial. You're still wondering why you wouldn't last. You haven't even made it to the cold plunge yet. That's coming in the next segment, along with the unspoken rules, the unclean politics, and why Roman bathing culture was more about performance than purity. But for now, wipe off that oil, return the strigel to the basket, and pray you didn't catch something that itched. Let's rejoin Gaius in the tepidarium, shall we? The air is humid, just warm enough to lull the senses, but not enough to boil them. Gaius leans back against a slick marble bench, slick not by design, but by a thin film of previous occupants' sweat. Around him, voices drift lazily through the mist economic gossip. The occasional philosophy quote, butchered by someone who once read half a scroll of Seneca, and a recurring cough from a man whose lungs are likely full of something far worse than phlegm. But that's the charm of Rome's social hygiene, isn't it? You don't just catch up with friends, you catch up with parasites, mold spores, and possibly a mild plague. Now, after soaking in his own filth, and pretending to listen to one man rant about his neighbour's offensive sandal odour, Gaius stands, bracing himself for what comes next. The frigidarium. The cold plunge. And here's where things get genuinely shocking. Roman bathers believed that after you've cooked yourself like a chicken thigh in the caldarium, the only logical thing to do is leap, stark naked, into an ice-cold pool. No transition. No warning. Just a wet marble ledge, an unexpected drop, and water that could slap the smug off a statue of Jupiter. Historians love to wax poetic about the discipline and invigoration this brought to the Roman citizen. In reality, the cold plunge was a test of cardiovascular luck. For elderly bathers, or anyone with a heartbeat slightly out of rhythm, this wasn't rejuvenation. It was a fast track to cardiac arrest. More than a few deaths were conveniently brushed off with, "He died at the baths," as if that made the whole episode somehow dignified. Gaius, being in his 30s and only mildly stressed by grain taxes, survives the plunge. Barely. His testicles have retreated somewhere near his kidneys, and for a few seconds he forgets how to speak. But now comes the part that really sets Roman bathhouses apart from any modern spa, the lingering. You see, you weren't supposed to just bathe and leave. That would imply hygiene was the point. No, you stayed. You chatted. You made deals. You networked with men who still had dirt under their fingernails from whatever passed as work earlier that day. Some brought their clients. Others, their enemies. The bathhouse was where reputations were built and sometimes destroyed. Now let's talk about Apollonius, a minor poet with major delusions. He comes to the bath not to cleanse, but to perform. Reclining dramatically on a bench, quoting his own work loud enough to wake the dead, and occasionally correcting others' Latin, even when uninvited. Which is always. Gaius loathes him, but can't ignore him, because Apollonius is oddly connected. His cousin once dated the son of a quaestor, and in Rome, that's practically nobility. Meanwhile, in the corner of the appetiterium, a minor argument breaks out. Someone's sandals have been stolen or swapped. You'd think in a society obsessed with status, people would label their things. But no, Everyone just tosses their clothes in an open changing area and hopes their cloak isn't picked up by a man riddled with scabies. Theft was so common that some bathhouses hired guards. Not to stop fights or assaults, mind you. Just to stop someone from taking your sweaty tunic. And let's pause to criticize this part, shall we? Roman engineering could build aqueducts across mountain ranges. They could calculate solar eclipses, organize legions with chilling precision, and yet, somehow, personal lockers were beyond their innovation. Maybe hygiene was a collective concept because privacy was a foreign one. You were meant to share everything here. Sweat, space, shame. But not sandals. Never sandals. Back to Gaius. He dries off, using a towel that's suspiciously damp before he touches it. He ignores the red spot on his ankle. Probably just a harmless rash. The strigel is returned. The oil flask refilled by a bored boy who doesn't even pretend to wipe his hands. And now comes the final ritual, sitting outside, fully dressed, hair still wet, catching the evening breeze that whispers sweet nothings and viral load across your damp skull. Roman physicians, some of whom actually did more good than harm, warned against this. Catching cold after the bath was a known killer, but vanity was stronger than caution. Looking fresh, clean, and just a little dewy was worth the risk of bronchitis. In fact, some scholars suggest that this very practice of going out wet day after day led to what we now call Roman cough, a polite way of saying you'll wheeze until you die. Meanwhile, vendors outside sell wine, sausages, and questionable fig pastries. Because nothing says clean like gorging on fermented meat and warm vinegar after marinating in 400 strangers' body fluids. Let's now briefly appreciate the socio-political irony of Roman bathhouses. These were supposed to be the great equalizers, spaces where class didn't matter, where slave and senator could, in theory, share a bench. And yet, entry times were segregated, services were tiered, and even water quality was better in wealthier districts. The illusion of equality, much like the illusion of hygiene, was all part of the performance, and don't think women were exempt. While they bathed separately, usually earlier in the day, they too faced their own form of scrutiny. Cleanliness for them was directly tied to virtue. A dirty woman was lazy. An overly clean one was suspiciously indulgent. You couldn't win, just like now, really. So, Gaius walks home. Cleanish. Aching slightly. Wondering if that itch will go away on its own. He'll return tomorrow, of course. Everyone does. Because despite the filth, the danger, the gossip, and the very real chance of catching something incurable, the Roman bathhouse was addictive. Not because it was safe or smart, but because it was expected. And that's the real horror. Not the diseases, not the nudity, but the sheer normalization of it all. The system worked, not because it was good, but because no one questioned it. Chapter 2, Roasted Alive in the Furnace Room. Down we go. Beneath the gleaming marble, the sculpted torsos, the echo of philosophical drivel and casual misogyny. Past the changing rooms, past the tepidarium and caldarium, and even past Gaius, who has now gone home with a mild rash and a borrowed towel. We descend into the hypercaust, the engine room of Roman wellness. Because while the bathhouse above glistened with prestige and the illusion of progress, its heart was hot, dark, choking, and human-powered. The hypercaust system was Rome's pride, an ingenious feat of engineering that allowed heat to rise from a furnace chamber through hollow floors and flue-lined walls, warming rooms above like a toastier kind of hell. The average Roman citizen never questioned it. To them, it was a marvel. Warm tiles, in winter, while their barbarian cousins shivered in wool and ignorance. Surely this was proof of Roman superiority. But no one ever asked who kept the fires burning. Meet Felix, a slave, born into servitude, sold at 12 to a contractor who maintained bathhouse furnaces across 2 districts. He's never bathed in the caldarium, never soaked in the frigidarium. His world is fire and sweat and smoke. He sleeps next to kindling, eats what rats don't claim, and dreams of cool air he'll never breathe. For the luxury of thousands, men like Felix worked 16-hour shifts, crawling through crawl spaces no wider than their shoulders, feeding endless wood into furnaces hot enough to blister skin 3 feet away. The air down here? It's not air. It's charcoal, ash, and the breath of men dying slowly by degrees. No ventilation, no masks. Just lungs filling with soot, until coughing becomes a soundtrack, rhythmic, wet, and ignored. Ancient Roman physicians even had a name for it, pulmonalis carbonica, a fancy way of saying he's been in the furnace too long. Let's pause for a bit of healthy sarcasm, shall we? Rome built an empire on order, logic, and reason. They mapped the stars, drained swamps, and paved roads straighter than most modern governments can think. And yet, in their infinite wisdom, they somehow missed the memo on occupational safety. No brakes, no tools, no laws protecting Felix and the dozen other half-naked firekeepers covered in scars and soot. Rome had gods for nearly everything: wine, war, doors, even sewer systems, but not one for workplace rights. And just in case you thought the job came with status, think again. The furnace room was the lowest rung. Even other slaves looked down on you. The bathhouse owner, a man named Marcus Lentulus, inherited the place from his uncle and visits twice a month. He's never seen the hypercaust. He brags about his heated walls to dinner guests, sipping watered wine while Felix coughs blood on bricks beneath his estate. Now, here's a lesser-known but disturbing fact. Furnace slaves often died young, not from flames, but from collapse. The intense heat-thinned bone density over time, while the constant inhalation of acidic smoke corroded their teeth, blackened their gums, and left them so brittle they could barely lift wood by 40. The lucky ones were sold off to brick kilns. The unlucky ones stayed until their bodies simply gave out and were dragged out like ash. And remember, these hypercausts didn't just warm the floors, they powered the entire ecosystem above. The water for the caldarium boiled below. The steam for the saunas bled from furnace pipes. Even the scent of perfumed rooms often masked the stench of roasting wood and roasting men. So while Gaius reclined in vapour and mused about politics, Felix burned one more log and another day off his life. Occasionally accidents happened. Bricks cracked, pressure built, fires leapt. And when they did, bathers didn't scream. Slaves did, because they were closest. There are records, rare but real, of entire bathhouses going up in smoke, leaving a pile of half-burnt corpses in the hypercaust while the clientele sued for lost sandals. Roman law valued a sandal more than a slave. Replacement costs were easier to calculate. There's something obscene about the contrast, isn't there? Above ground, laughter, gossip, gleaming torsos bathed in golden light. Below ground, smoke, silence, the sound of splinters and wheezing. And yet the two worlds were one, interdependent. The comfort of the many literally fueled by the suffering of the few. It wasn't hidden, it just wasn't questioned. Let's not let them off the hook too easily. The Romans loved to congratulate themselves on their civility. They wrote poems about virtue. They built temples to justice. But their world functioned on a simple equation. The suffering of some made life bitter for others. And they wrapped it in stone and story and called it civilization. Even the design of the hypercaust system tells you everything. Slaves like Felix couldn't even stand upright. The system was efficient, yes, but efficient for whom? Certainly not for the men crawling through narrow tunnels, spines bent like reeds, carrying logs in near total darkness, lit only by the angry glow of fire. Every improvement made to the system served the men above. The ones who left dry, who paid with coin, not skin. As the day ends, Felix throws in the last log. His hands are blistered, his chest tight. He hasn't eaten since yesterday, but he's grateful the flames didn't backdraft. Another slave wasn't so lucky last week. His screams echoed through the flue system and startled a senator mid-sentence about land reforms. The owner gave everyone a partial refund. He gave the body to the rats. Above, the bathers don't know Felix's name. They never will. To them, the heat is just there, like sunshine, like air. They don't wonder who feeds it. And if they do, it's only to complain that the caldarium was a bit chilly today. And so ends another day in the belly of Roman luxury. Felix lies down on a pile of coal sacks, closes his eyes, and dreams, not of freedom, not of justice, but of a single minute of cool, clean air. He'll never get it. But the bathhouse will be warm tomorrow. Above the furnace, the bathhouse is glowing. By the time the first stream of heat rises through the floor tiles, the bathers are already arriving. Some wrapped in loose wool cloaks, others bare-chested, sandals slapping lazily on worn mosaic floors. The air is thick with the scent of oil, damp linen, and ambition. Because here, in this gleaming temple of heat and sweat, every movement, every glance, every ripple of muscle is political. Let's start with a lie the Romans love to tell: all men are equal in the baths. It's adorable, really. The idea that status vanished with your toga, that in the steamy halls of the thermae, rich and poor soaked side by side as fellow citizens, united in hygiene and harmony. Reality? Far murkier and far more Roman. The bathhouse wasn't an escape from the hierarchy. It was an extension of it, steamed and perfumed to disguise the smell of competition. The layout itself betrayed the fiction. Richer patrons entered through private doors, often escorted by slaves who carried not just towels but weapons. Because yes, murder in the bathhouse wasn't unheard of. Meanwhile, the lower classes queued in narrow corridors, jostling for space in appoditeria that hadn't been cleaned since Caligula's first scandal. Enter again our increasingly disgruntled friend, Gaius, fresh off yesterday's rash and a disappointing lunch of slightly sour garum. He's back, of course, because the bathhouse isn't just about getting clean. It's where deals are made, where enemies are flattered, where you're seen. He passes through the main arch and nods to a few familiar faces. There's Publius, a retired soldier who now runs a debt collection service and likes to remind everyone how many Gauls he personally skewered. He's got scars. He's got stories. He's also got a fungal foot infection, currently bubbling quietly in the shallow end of the caldarium. Then there's Titus, impossibly groomed, oiled head to toe in imported myrrh, and determined to let everyone know about it. His toenails shine. His nipples have rings. He lounges like a sculpture come to life and speaks with the serene confidence of someone who's never worked a day in his life. Titus is everything Gaius resents, and everything he tries to mimic when he thinks no one is watching. This, more than anything, is what the Roman bathhouse specialized in: performance. Not of art, but of self. The strut from frigidarium to caldarium wasn't just to stretch your legs, it was a catwalk. Muscles were flexed, bellies were sucked in, backs were arched just slightly to hint at youthful vigor, even if your spine was crying from last week's aqueduct repair. Everything was a signal: health, wealth, virility. And let's not forget the body hair. Romans had a complicated relationship with it. Too much, and you were a barbarian. Too little, and you were suspiciously Greek. The ideal was smooth, but only in the right places. So bathhouses became home to another charming ritual: plucking. Using tweezers made from bone or metal, men and their slaves yanked out hairs one by one, wincing in stoic silence, because complaining was for cowards and Carthaginians. Of course, no one plucked themselves. That was peasant behaviour. You had a tonsor, a sort of barber-surgeon hybrid who doubled as a waxer, pimple popper, and sometimes leech applier, depending on your package. He'd do his work while you chatted with your peers, trying not to flinch as he gouged out a blackhead the size of a lentil. Meanwhile, debates erupted over the bath's true purpose. Was it for health? For pleasure? For public morale? The answer, as always, was yes, depending on who was asking and who was watching. The emperors, of course, loved them. Building a grand bathhouse was a surefire way to secure popularity without actually improving people's lives. Give them warm water and they'll forget the tax hikes. Bread and circuses? No, better baths and steam. Critics existed though. Seneca, the grumpiest stoic this side of the Tiber, famously complained about the noise of the baths. The shouting, the grunting, the slap of flesh on marble, the high-pitched squeal of a man being epilated against his will. He called it distracting. He called it vulgar. But even Seneca knew better than to avoid them entirely. No bathhouse meant no presence. And in Rome, absence was political suicide. Let's pause here and prod a bit deeper into that hypocrisy. The same elite who preached moderation, discipline, and civic virtue spent hours sprawled in steam rooms, being massaged with expensive oils by underfed slaves while pontificating about the moral decay of society. The same men who outlawed excess celebrated decadence, provided it was clad in limestone and labelled tradition. In many ways, the Roman bathhouse was a mirror, one that reflected not who they were, but who they pretended to be. Back to Gaius. He's now wedged between two equestrians arguing about a new road contract. He laughs at their jokes. He nods in agreement, though he's not listening. He's thinking about what it would take to afford a better towel. The one he has leaves fibres behind. Titus noticed. Around him, the air thickens with steam. The caldarium is full. The floor sweats as much as the men. Somewhere, a drop of oil sizzles as it hits a hot tile. Two young men begin wrestling, playfully, then not so playfully. A few others cheer. One man watches too long. This is normal. There's no music, no ambient flutes, just bodies, breath, splashes and murmurs. And yet the bathhouse hums with energy, a kind of ritualistic rhythm. Every move is choreographed. Every towel flick, every shoulder pat, every rise from the bench. It's not relaxation, it's theatre. And every actor knows his role. The poor man who jokes too loudly, hoping to be liked. The rich man who speaks softly, knowing he'll be heard. The aging official who flexes when he thinks no one's looking. The youth who pretends not to notice. All sharing the same air, the same water, the same lie. Cleanliness, in the Roman world, wasn't just about the body, it was about image, about appearing healthy, virtuous, strong, even if you weren't. And the bathhouse, for all its warmth and water, was never truly clean. It was layered in sweat and status, ambition and bacteria. But it sparkled. And in Rome, sparkle was enough. Chapter 3, the strigel and the scrape. Let's talk about beauty, Roman style. Because for all their conquests, aqueducts and gods with suspiciously human flaws, the ancient Romans were obsessed with appearances. Not in the modern, filtered, selfie kind of way, but in a ritualistic, oily, sometimes violent devotion to bodily presentation that blurred the line between hygiene and humiliation. And nothing captured that better than the humble, brutal, and widely shared strigel. The strigel wasn't some delicate tool of self-care. It was a metal blade curved like a miniature scythe, often bronze or iron, used to scrape the human body like a slab of meat at a butcher's stall. The process was simple. Coat yourself in oil. Let it mingle with every impurity your skin had to offer. Sweat, dirt, dead cells, the regrets of last night's wine. And then drag a sharp edge across your flesh until you were left raw, gleaming, and, allegedly, clean. It sounds barbaric, and in a way it was. But in Rome, it was normal. Expected. A daily exfoliation ritual performed publicly, often by a slave or attendant who had neither gloves nor boundaries, nor a strong stomach. And make no mistake, the strigel didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, senator or gladiator, Every Roman body endured the same medieval-style squeegee. Because soap, that magical miracle of modernity, simply didn't exist in their skincare vocabulary. Enter Livia, one of the rare female bathers in this world of sweaty senators and flexing equestrians. While men strutted and scraped in public, women often had their own bathing hours, tucked away in separate facilities or shunted into the early morning schedule, when the water was colder, the floors dirtier, and the attendants less enthusiastic. Equality, Roman style. Livia, a merchant's wife with ambitions far above her husband's earnings, arrives with a small entourage. Her servant carries a jar of perfumed oil, imported, expensive, and almost certainly diluted. She removes her stola with practiced ease, revealing a body meticulously plucked, scraped, and occasionally leached of blood by her personal cosmetai. A fancy word for someone whose job description included pimple popping and mole slicing. Her strigel is silver. Decorative. More symbol than tool. She doesn't use it herself. That's what the help is for. Now let's step back and truly appreciate the absurdity of this system. Imagine, if you will, scraping your naked body with a shared metal blade in a public space filled with strangers, then casually flicking the oily residue onto the floor or into a communal basin. No disinfectant, no private stalls, just raw skin and recycled fluids. And yet this wasn't just tolerated, it was praised. Roman poets, in a feat of denial only matched by modern marketing, wrote odes to the glow of freshly scraped limbs, the sheen of cleanliness, the divine beauty of glistening thighs. Of course, there were consequences. Shared strigils meant shared infections. Skin conditions were rampant, impetigo, eczema, and delightful clusters of boils that spread faster than gossip in the forum. But instead of changing their tools or methods, Romans simply added more oil, more perfume, more prayer. Because in a society where outward appearance was everything, internal rot was just a private inconvenience. Even the oils themselves were questionable. The wealthy imported exotic blends from Egypt or Syria, laced with myrrh, rose, and sometimes powdered lead, for that luminous, slowly poisoned glow. The poor made do with cheaper alternatives, often rancid olive oil mixed with herbs and mystery. One popular blend, known as gladiator oil, was rumoured to be made from the sweat of actual fighters scraped off in the arena and sold in jars. Aphrodisiac, they claimed. Probably staph infection, in reality. And the strigil wasn't just a tool, it was a status symbol. Elaborate sets came in carved ivory cases, engraved with gods or nude wrestlers. Owning a beautiful strigil said you had taste. Using one said you had nothing to hide. But more often, it said you were following the script, that you understood Rome's golden rule. The body must be groomed, displayed, and judged, daily, publicly, relentlessly. Let's check in again with Gaius. He's observing a man get his back scraped while sipping watered-down wine from a chipped cup. The man grunts with every stroke. The slave scraping him does it mechanically, eyes dead, arms trembling. Gaius thinks briefly of asking for a session, then remembers the boil under his shoulder. Best to let it drain naturally. Meanwhile, in the next room, Livia examines herself in a bronze mirror so polished it distorts her face. She frowns. A new wrinkle? A shadow of a blemish? Her attendant readies a pin, no anesthesia. Just technique. A quick jab, a sharp squeeze, a tiny cloth dabbed in vinegar. Done. Livia doesn't flinch, she's Roman. Pain is part of the process. Here's a dark irony. The more the Romans chased beauty, the more damage they did to themselves. Skin-lightening creams were laced with mercury. Hair dyes used lead. Even the pumice stones for exfoliation were so rough, they left micro-tears in the skin, opening pathways for every bacteria lurking in the warm, damp corners of the bathhouse. And still, they persisted, because to not participate was to be unclean, not just in body, but in mind. Dirtiness was moral failure. Grooming was virtue. And the strigel, that was your sword against decay. Criticism feels inevitable here, doesn't it? For all their advancements, the roads, the law codes, the plumbing, Romans remained prisoners of appearance. They built empires, yet flinched at wrinkles. They conquered continents, but not their own insecurities. And in doing so, they left behind not just ruins, but a legacy of obsessive self-surveillance that echoes even today in mirrors, spas, and skincare aisles. The bathhouse, with its steam and its scrapers, wasn't about health. It was about conformity. You went not just to clean your body, but to prove you belonged, to be seen, to be judged, to survive the social pressure that boiled just beneath the tiles. As the day winds down, the scraping slows. The slaves wipe their tools, sort of. The oil jars are sealed, the mirrors tucked away. Livia leaves with her chin high. Gaius scratches his arm and pretends it's not bleeding. Above them, the sun sets. Below them, Felix stokes the fire again. Because tomorrow, they'll all return. And so will the strigel. Still glistening from their last scrape, our bathers now settle into the second act of Roman grooming, a phase not so much about maintenance as it was about submission. Submission to fashion, to social pressure, to the cruel gods of Roman hygiene whose commandments included things like bleed yourself occasionally, pluck everything visible, and never ever let them see your body hair grow unchecked. So here we are, in the tonstrina, the grooming corner. Not a relaxing salon, but a tightly packed chamber of shared misery. The air is scented with oils, sour sweat, and the faint iron tang of blood. Not metaphorical blood, actual blood, because beauty, Roman style, meant making small sacrifices daily, and sometimes big ones, depending on your barber's mood. The tonsor, the Roman barber, wasn't just a hair cutter. He was a cultural surgeon, part stylist, part torturer, part therapist you didn't ask for. His job included shaving beards with razors so blunt they could double as letter openers, slicing off warts, lancing boils, and even applying leeches if your skin looked overheated. There were no gloves, no disinfectant, no training really, just sharp tools, stronger opinions, and an audience. Yes, an audience. Because in true Roman fashion, grooming was not done in private. You sat, mostly naked, sometimes fully, on a bench beside 2 or 3 other equally exposed men, and waited for your turn to be picked apart. The tonsor would begin with your beard, scraping along your jaw with a blade shared by at least a dozen others that day. If you flinched, too bad. If you bled, he'd just flick it off like excess oil. Gaius is back, of course. And today, it's beard day. He's not thrilled about it. The last time he got shaved here, the tonsor nicked his cheek and sealed it with a hot coin. Tradition, they said. Discipline, they said. Infection, his body said. But Gaius needs to look clean. The prefect's nephew is in town, and word is he's hiring. First impressions matter, especially the parts of your face that still have skin on them. Let's not forget the nose hairs. In Rome, even those had expectations. Long ones were uncouth, visible ones were tragic. So the tonsor, holding iron tweezers that looked like they were forged in Hades, would lean in and pluck them. No warning, no ceremony, just grab, yank, and move on. The scream? Optional. The tears? Expected. Dignity? Sacrificed hours ago with your tunic. And women didn't escape this either. In fact, Livia, ever the ambassador of societal pressure, is getting her own version of this torment. Her cosmetae, trained in the fine art of painful perfection, are applying depilatory paste to her arms and face. The ingredients? Resin, ash, and something called quicklime, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a chemical compound that burns through organic tissue with remarkable enthusiasm. She sits still, eyes closed, enduring it like a general before battle. The smell is acrid, the sting is immediate. But the alternative is social suicide. A visible moustache, even faint, and she'd be mocked at market stalls, whispered about at dinner parties, maybe even excluded from the next religious procession. Because in Rome, a woman's hair wasn't just hair, it was a litmus test of her morals. Now let's address the bloodletting. Yes, it was real. Yes, it happened in bathhouses. If you were feeling sluggish, tired, or simply too full of bad humours, the local iatrolipta part masseur, part medicine man might suggest opening a vein. Just a little. Maybe at the elbow, maybe behind the knee. A controlled bleed to rebalance the body's energies. There was no medical license, no sterilised needle, just a small blade, a towel, and hope. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes people passed out and were dragged to the frigidarium to wake up, or not. Either way, the show continued. The man next in line would take the seat, perhaps wiping a bit of blood away first, or not. And in case you're wondering, yes, there was a hierarchy to pain too. Men who endured silent plucking were seen as stoic. Those who flinched were mocked. A man who yelped during a boil lance might never live it down. Children were taught early to sit still through agony because the bathhouse didn't care for tears. Rome, after all, wasn't built on comfort. It was built on endurance, often someone else's. The bathhouse walls, if they could talk, would scream. But instead, they echoed with laughter, bravado, and the sharp flick of metal against flesh. Men performed strength through stillness. Women performed virtue through silence. And both did it under the watchful eyes of their peers. Now let's take a quick detour into cosmetics, because the line between grooming and decoration in Rome was razor thin, literally. After all the scraping, bleeding and burning, you'd apply a layer of cerussa, a foundation made from white lead. It gave the skin a pale, luminous glow. It also slowly poisoned you. But hey, beauty hurts, and then kills. But not before people compliment your skin. Add some kohl around the eyes, some red ochre on the cheeks, and you were ready. Ready to strut through the forum, to bargain for overpriced fish, to pretend everything on your face wasn't secretly trying to kill you. And now, the criticism that hangs over all this like steam in the caldarium? For all their advancement, the Romans never questioned the ritual. They questioned the gods. They debated law. But not once did anyone stop and say, maybe dragging a blade across my body every day with no hygiene standards is a bad idea. Pain meant discipline. Blood meant balance. The body was a battlefield, and the bathhouse was both barracks and arena. So Gaius leaves the tonsor chair, face stinging, nose twitching. Livia walks out, skin glowing, jaw clenched. Neither says a word. Both have done their duty. And somewhere beneath the marble, Felix throws another log into the fire, wondering what madness tomorrow will bring. Chapter 4. Nudity, Status, and Social Tension. The bathhouse was never really about bathing. That's the first thing you need to understand. Soap didn't exist, water wasn't filtered, and the average Roman had no clue what bacteria was. Hygiene was the excuse. The reality? It was all about performance. Who you were seen with, how you carried yourself, and where you planted your bare, sweating body determined your rank as much as the coins in your purse. The appetiterium, the changing room, was where this game began. It wasn't just where you tossed your clothes into a niche and prayed they'd still be there afterward. It was the first arena of judgment. Everyone entered the same way, but not everyone was equal. A senator might leave his cloak with a trusted slave, who then stood guard like a watchdog. A merchant might slip a coin to the attendant, securing a better spot near the front. And the poor? They piled their ragged tunics in a corner and hoped nobody mistook them for cleaning rags. From the moment you stripped, you were vulnerable. Not just physically, though that mattered. Scars, sagging flesh, and suspicious blemishes told their own stories. But socially, if your body was too soft, you were decadent. Too lean, and you looked impoverished. Too hairy, barbaric. Too smooth, suspiciously Greek. Rome didn't believe in body positivity. They believed in body hierarchy. And everyone was ranked. Take Gaius, our perpetually unimpressive clerk. He undresses cautiously, avoiding eye contact. His body is neither strong nor weak, neither hairy nor bare. Mediocrity incarnate, which, in Rome, might be the worst category of all, because in a world obsessed with appearances, being forgettable was almost a crime. He folds his tunic neatly, a small act of dignity, though he knows no one cares. Now look at Titus, that self-proclaimed embodiment of Roman masculinity. He strips down with the theatrical flourish of a gladiator removing his armour, except the only battle he's fought today was against a too-ripe melon at the market. Still the muscles glisten, the oiled skin gleams, and the eyes of the room slide his way. Titus thrives here. The bathhouse is his stage, his Colosseum. Every flex is applause. Every nod is validation. And here's where the sarcasm is hard to resist. For a society that conquered half the known world, the Romans spent a suspicious amount of energy worrying about what they looked like naked. They built aqueducts, drained swamps, planned military campaigns with terrifying precision, and then lost sleep over the size of their calves. Civilization, it seems, is fragile when propped up by fragile egos. Beyond the changing rooms lay the real battleground, the benches of the tepidarium and caldarium. Seating wasn't assigned, but it might as well have been. The prime spots, nearest the warm wall, best light, loudest echoes, were reserved for men of rank. You could sit there if you dared, but the stairs would cut deeper than any dagger. And if you overstayed, you'd be frozen out of business deals for months. Because that's what the bathhouse really did. It blurred leisure and politics until they were inseparable. You didn't just sweat, you networked. Contracts were whispered over steam. Laws were debated, while half naked. Marriages were arranged, dowries discussed, alliances forged. The Senate might meet in marble halls, but the seeds of decisions were often planted right here, between splashes and strigels. Imagine it. Two equestrians leaning close in the caldarium, murmuring about a land deal while steam curls off their shoulders. A general sits nearby, pretending to doze, ears wide open. A merchant, too eager, interrupts with a joke about garum prices. He laughs alone. Nobody responds. His career is over before his skin is dried. And then there's Apollonius, our pretentious poet, reclining like he owns the room, quoting himself between coughs. Nobody asked. Nobody cares. But he's loud enough that some nod along, hoping to look cultured. This is how mediocrity survives, not by merit, but by sheer volume. Let's also not pretend this was an innocent social club. The bathhouse was rife with exploitation. Young boys, sent as attendants, were ogled, harassed, and worse. Women, when admitted, endured whispers, stares, and the constant suggestion that their presence was indulgent rather than essential. Power was naked here, quite literally. If you were lower in status, your body was currency, one you spent whether you wanted to or not. Even clothing, or the lack of it, sent signals. The towel you used, the sandals you left behind, the oil flask at your side, all markers of class. A fine linen wrap whispered wealth. A rough woolen cloth screamed poverty. And heaven forbid you showed up without one at all. Nakedness was acceptable, cheapness was not. And yet, for all this posturing, the irony is painful. The bathhouse didn't actually make you healthy. If anything, it probably made you sicker. The steam opened pores, sure, but into those pores went every contagion in the city. Skin met skin, oils mingled, and water circulated without ever being drained. What you absorbed here wasn't vitality, but vulnerability. Still, the Romans called it cleanliness. They believed appearances equaled health. A glowing body meant a strong constitution, never mind the chronic cough rattling beneath. Shiny skin meant vigour, even if you were slowly poisoning yourself with leaded makeup. They confused the image of wellness with wellness itself, and that illusion kept the whole steaming machine running. So Gaius sits quietly on a bench, invisible, while Titus soaks in attention like oil. Apollonius drones, Livia suffers in silence in her segregated corner, and Felix, somewhere beneath their feet, feeds another log to the fire. The hierarchy holds. The performance continues, and no one questions why this ritual suffocating, unsanitary and shallow has become the very heart of Roman life. Because questioning would mean changing, and Romans hated change almost as much as they hated body hair. If the apoditorium was the curtain rise, then the caldarium was the stage, and the audience wasn't silent. Voices carried through the mist, sharp whispers, booming laughter, half-swallowed insults. To bathe in Rome wasn't to cleanse. It was to audition. Every movement, every word was observed, judged, remembered. And in a city where reputation was currency, the bathhouse was the mint. Gaius knew this well. He sat carefully, shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to suggest confidence but not arrogance. His ears tuned to conversations that were not meant for him. Two men beside him muttered about a pending grain shipment delayed by storms in Alexandria. Their tone suggested disaster, but their eyes gleamed with opportunity. A delayed shipment meant scarcity. Scarcity meant higher prices. Higher prices meant profit for those who had storage. Gaius didn't. He had debts. Still, he smiled faintly, as if he too might benefit, though inside he felt the old burn of envy. That was the bathhouse's cruelest feature. It forced you to sit in your failures. Everyone around you dripped wealth oils imported from Arabia, towels soft as clouds, toned bodies maintained by time you didn't have. And you, stripped of pretense along with your clothes, were reduced to what you really were: skin, scars, and silence. Meanwhile, Titus lounged like a marble statue brought to life, only more obnoxious. He cracked jokes about gladiator matches, slapped shoulders as if he owned them, and occasionally stood to pour oil along his arms, just for the spectacle of it. His confidence was contagious. Men laughed louder around him, women glanced longer, even boys fetching water leaned closer. That's how power spread, not by decree, but by performance. The irony, of course, is that the bathhouse was supposed to symbolize egalitas equality, a place where rank melted in steam. But steam doesn't dissolve hierarchy, it magnifies it. Senators whispered policy over warm tiles while plebeians pretended not to listen. Generals compared scars, each story a battle won. Merchants boasted of ships, omitting the ones that sank. And in the background, slaves scrubbed benches, invisible unless they faltered, in which case they were punished publicly. Criticism here practically writes itself. Rome, the self-proclaimed beacon of civilization, built monuments to democracy and virtue, then turned its most communal institution into a catwalk of ego and exploitation. Equality? Only if you didn't look too closely. But gossip was the real engine of these halls. The bathhouse was the Twitter feed of antiquity, complete with misinformation, scandal, and outrage that lasted precisely until the next scandal arrived. A senator's mistress seen at the wrong hour. A general's son caught flexing too much in the mirror. A merchant's daughter whispering too close to a rival's wife. Every slip, every laugh, every sigh was noted and spun. Apollonius, the insufferable poet, thrived in this environment. He spoke loudly of art, but really he trafficked in rumour, wrapping gossip in metaphor so transparent even the dullest bather understood. The lion sleeps while the fox steals the hen, he would say, eyes glancing toward a balding senator dozing on a bench. The men chuckled. The senator awoke later, unsure why everyone smirked at him. And let's not romanticize this gossip. It ruined lives. One whispered accusation that a man's body seemed too frail, too blemished, too unmanly, could echo into the forum, into his workplace, into his household. In a world where masculinity was civic duty, a weak appearance was political suicide. The bathhouse was the breeding ground of such reputations, and no amount of actual skill could erase a rumour once it was soaked into the tiles. Livia, navigating the women's hours, faced her own version of this theatre. Here, whispers were sharper, honed like blades. Women compared perfumes, criticised wrinkles, measured each other's hips and ankles with merciless eyes. A sagging arm became proof of sloth. A new dress too fine was proof of arrogance. And always the undercurrent of morality. A woman too interested in her own reflection was surely corrupt, surely dangerous. It's almost comic. Rome conquered continents, built aqueducts across impossible terrain, and yet half its population spent their days locked in mortal combat over who looked better wet. But that was the system. Appearance equaled virtue, and virtue equaled trust. Without it, you had nothing. Let's return to Gaius. He sits quietly, listening. He's learned the art of stillness, say little, observe much. But even stillness could betray you. Too quiet, and you looked meek. Too loud, and you seemed desperate. There was no winning, only surviving. And survival meant knowing when to laugh at Titus's jokes, when to nod at Apollonius's metaphors, and when to rise from the bench before anyone noticed how long you'd lingered. The bathhouse's cold plunge, the frigidarium, added its own layer of humiliation. You were expected to leap, to endure the shock without a whimper. Men who gasped were mocked. Those who hesitated were branded cowards. It was a ritual of toughness masquerading as hygiene. Rome didn't just demand you look clean, it demanded you perform strength, even if you caught pneumonia doing it. Meanwhile, beneath the floors, Felix still sweated in the furnace room. He could hear faint echoes of laughter above, distorted by stone and smoke. For him, there was no gossip, no networking, no politics, only fire and orders barked from men who'd never scraped their own bodies with a blade. He wondered, sometimes, why Romans called themselves civilized. That's the criticism that lingers, isn't it? Civilization, in Rome's definition, meant architecture, conquest, laws written in marble. But if you stripped it down, literally, you found the same primal anxieties, the same shallow judgments, the same obsession with status wrapped in the illusion of cleanliness. The bathhouse wasn't a symbol of progress, it was a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. So the day ends. Gaius dries himself on a damp towel, Titus leaves trailed by admirers, Apollonius recites his final line, and Livia walks home with her jaw set against the whispers. The gossip will spread. The reputations will shift. And tomorrow it will all happen again, as it always does. Because in Rome, the bathhouse wasn't optional. It was compulsory. To miss it was to vanish. And vanishing, in Rome, was worse than death. Chapter 5, The Smell of Status. Step into the bathhouse, and the first thing that hits you isn't the steam, or the warmth, or even the sight of 40 half-naked strangers trying too hard to look relaxed. It's the smell. A cloud of oils, perfumes, and ointments hovers like incense, clinging to every stone, every bench, every drop of condensation on the walls. To a visitor, it might seem luxurious, sophisticated, even soothing. But to a Roman, it was necessary armour, because without it, the bathhouse would smell like what it was, a festering pit of sweat, skin, and sickness. The Romans were masters of masking. They believed scent was more than pleasant, it was moral. To smell good was to be good. A stinking body signalled vice, laziness, corruption. So they drowned themselves in concoctions of myrrh, cinnamon, saffron, and roses, carried in delicate glass flasks or clay jars. Men oiled their chests until they glistened. Women anointed their arms with rose water. Even slaves rubbed their masters down with scented unguents, though the slaves themselves reeked of labour and smoke. But let's strip away the glamour. Behind the perfume was rot. Those oils didn't cleanse, they sealed. A body coated in oil and scraped with a strigel wasn't rid of filth. It was marinated in it, like a chicken left too long in garlic and wine. The strigel scraped off surface grime, yes, but it also opened micro-cuts, into which bacteria and fungus happily marched. Cover that with perfume, and you had the Roman equivalent of spraying cologne over a garbage bin. Consider Gaius, ever our reluctant participant. He emerges from the tepidarium, glistening with a thin film of oil infused with saffron, a luxury he couldn't afford but borrowed from a friend. He smells faintly floral, faintly sour. The man beside him reeks of myrrh so heavily it makes Gaius's eyes water. To outsiders, these men look polished. To their bodies, they're incubators. The itch under Gaius's arm? That's not sweat. That's ringworm thriving in the warm, oily darkness. And here's where the historical irony cuts deep. The Romans prided themselves on being cleaner than barbarian tribes. They mocked Germans and Britons for smelling of mud and smoke. Yet those same tribes, bathing in rivers and streams, probably carried fewer skin infections than the perfumed elite of Rome. Civilization, it seems, can sometimes mean inventing prettier ways to be filthy. Perfumes, of course, weren't just about hygiene. They were about status. A cheap oil smelled like rancid olives. A fine one, imported from Arabia or India, carried hints of frankincense or cinnamon luxuries priced so high that wearing them was like announcing your tax bracket on your skin. Walk into the caldarium smelling of cinnamon, and heads turned. Not because you were healthy, but because you were rich enough to smell like pie in a city that mostly smelled like sewage. Women like Libya suffered even more from this olfactory arms race. For them, perfume was a weapon and a trap. Too much, and you reeked of vanity. Too little, and you stank of neglect. The balance was impossible, especially since most perfumes were cut with lead-based powders to brighten the complexion. Livia's cheeks glow, yes, but not with health. They glow with slow poisoning, her skin whitening while her blood quietly corrodes. She knows it. She doesn't care. Appearances must be maintained. And let's not forget the darker underside of this scented obsession, the diseases masked by oils. Romans had no antibiotics, no understanding of contagion. If you had sores, you covered them with balsam. If you had lice, you rubbed on vinegar. If your gums bled, you chewed herbs to hide the smell. The outward gloss mattered far more than the festering inside. A senator with syphilis could still command respect if he smelled like roses, a slave with clean skin but no perfume. He was dismissed as dirty. This inversion of logic is almost laughable and tragic. Rome advanced medicine in some ways, yes. They catalogued diseases. They invented surgical tools. But in daily life they chose denial. Instead of confronting infection, they perfumed it. Instead of admitting sickness, they scented it. And in the steamy air of the bathhouse, those scents mixed into a miasma of deception. The frigidarium, for instance, wasn't crisp and refreshing. It reeked faintly of mildew, faintly of bodies. Men plunged in anyway, gasping, their pores wide open, their cuts stinging. Around them floated oils shed from dozens of skins. The surface shimmered like sunlight, but it wasn't light, it was fat. And yet, when they emerged, shivering but glistening, they felt renewed. They weren't clean. They were convinced. And in Rome, that was enough. Criticism practically begs to be spoken. What kind of civilization defines health, not by the absence of disease, but by the presence of perfume? The answer is one obsessed with image. Rome didn't invent hygiene. It invented the performance of hygiene. And like any performance, it required props, oils, strigels, perfumes, and an audience willing to applaud while ignoring the smell seeping through the stage. Back to Gaius. He leaves the bath smelling faintly of saffron and sweat. People nod politely as he passes, reassured by his sheen. They don't see the rash spreading under his arm. They don't hear the cough rattling in his chest. He smells acceptable. And that is what matters. Above him, Titus douses himself in anise oil, laughing, radiant, admired. His admirers don't notice the lesion on his thigh. They inhale cinnamon and pretend it isn't there. Livia, veiled, glides home, cheeks white as marble, lips pale from lead. Her neighbours whisper admiration. None notice her faint trembling. And beneath them all, Felix shovels another log into the furnace, coughing blood into the ashes. No perfume for him, no saffron oil, just smoke. So the bathhouse stinks beautifully. Rome congratulates itself. And history, as always, smells the irony. Perfume could mask many things, but not death. Under the saffron and roses, beneath the cinnamon oils and balsam ointments, the Roman bathhouse was less a sanctuary of health than a petri dish with marble floors. The irony is staggering. Romans believed they were at their most hygienic here. Yet the very act of bathing together made the thermae one of the best disease distribution systems the ancient world ever designed. The steam that curled up from the hypocaust didn't just open pores, it opened doorways. Skin softened. Lungs expanded. The body absorbed everything around it. Perfume, yes, but also pathogens. The warm, wet air was paradise for bacteria and fungus, though of course the Romans had no concept of such things. They spoke instead of miasma. Bad air corrupted by moral decay as much as filth. If you were sick, it was your fault. Not the bathhouse. Never the bathhouse. Take tuberculosis, for example. The Roman cough. Listen closely in a caldarium and you'd hear it everywhere. The wet, hacking rasp of lungs slowly collapsing. Tuberculosis loves close contact, loves moisture, loves crowds. The bathhouse offered all three every day to thousands. And when Gaius sat on a bench beside a coughing man, he wasn't sharing philosophy. He was sharing bacteria. Or look at ringworm, the parasitic fungus that thrived in warm, damp skin folds. Easy to catch, impossible to ignore. Men left the baths with circular rashes, convinced they were minor irritations, and spread them at home, at work, at dinner parties. The strigel, scraped across dozens of bodies, carried more than dirt. It carried spores. A shared tool was a shared infection, and nobody thought twice. Even the pools themselves, the cold plunge, the lukewarm tepidarium, were breeding grounds. Water wasn't drained daily, or even weekly. It sat, clouded with oils, hair, and the invisible residue of every man who entered. The shimmer on its surface? That wasn't light. It was a film of fat and sweat. Romans joked about it. They still waded in, because to skip the plunge was to admit weakness. And in Rome, weakness was worse than illness. And let's not forget sexually transmitted diseases, though Romans didn't frame them that way. For them, a sore on the groin was a punishment from Venus, a sign of immoral indulgence, never mind that a third of the men in the caldarium probably had one. Perfume hid the smell. Oil softened the swelling. The cycle continued. No one asked questions because asking would mean confronting the fragility of their civilized world. Livia, poor Livia, wasn't spared either. Women's baths, while smaller, carried the same risks. Shared pumice stones spread skin infections. Depilatory pastes made with lime caused chemical burns that festered. Perfumes laced with lead crept through the skin into the blood, weakening bones, stealing fertility. But so long as cheeks glowed pale and hairless arms glistened, appearances triumphed over health. The criticism practically begs to be shouted. What good is civilization if it polishes the surface while letting the body rot beneath? Rome built aqueducts to supply its baths with water, yet that same water, stagnant in pools, became poison. They engineered hypocausts to warm the air, yet that warmth spread contagion as efficiently as it spread comfort. They believed themselves the cleanest of peoples, but their hygiene was theatre, a glittering lie in saffron-scented bottles, and the smells themselves became suspicious. Strong perfume was admired, yes, but also questioned. Why so much? What are you hiding? Was that rose oil, or was it infection? The line between beauty and disease blurred. Men accused rivals of over-perfuming as a way of hinting at corruption. Women, too fragrant, were whispered about as promiscuous. Even smell became a weapon. Meanwhile, beneath all this ritual, bodies deteriorated quietly. The elderly, forced to endure cold plunges, often collapsed. The young, exposed daily to infections, carried coughs that never left them. Even the strongest gladiators, whose sweat was bottled and sold as aphrodisiac, often limped from fungal infections in their feet. But so long as the body glistened in oil and the nose caught a whiff of roses, society nodded in approval. Consider Felix, our furnace slave. He rarely saw the bathhouse above, but even he inhaled its sickness. The smoke he breathed carried not just ash, but the particles of oil and skin flakes drifting down through cracks. His cough was no different from the coughs above, except no one perfumed his. His death would be soot-covered, unscented, unremarkable. Civilization never pretended to hide his decay. What's remarkable is how normal all this was. Romans didn't complain. They didn't protest. They simply accepted the infections, the coughs, the lesions, as the cost of culture. To smell good was to be Roman. To be Roman was to bathe. To bathe was to sicken. And still they returned daily, willingly, to the very places that slowly destroyed them. Perhaps that's the truest critique of all. Rome's bathhouses weren't monuments to health. They were monuments to denial. Glittering palaces of steam and stone where people pretended they were clean while quietly trading diseases with every breath. So Gaius leaves again, perfumed, glistening, admired. Titus strides out radiant, adored, oblivious to the sore beneath his tunic. Livia walks home pale and trembling, her lead-dusted cheeks praised as beautiful. And Felix coughs blood into the fire, unseen. And the smell of roses lingers. Chapter 6. Pedicures with pumice and blood. If you thought scraping your body raw with a strigel was the height of Roman grooming, think again. The bathhouse wasn't finished with you after oil and perfume, not by a long shot. Because just beyond the steaming caldarium, in a corner often filled with groans and the metallic scent of iron, awaited the tonsor, the Roman barber. And this man was less stylist and more butcher with a sense of humour. To be clear, the tonsor was indispensable. Romans didn't see grooming as luxury. They saw it as duty. A man who failed to maintain himself wasn't just unattractive, he was untrustworthy, un-Roman, almost barbarian. So into the chair you went. If you could call a worn wooden bench a chair surrounded by other men waiting their turn, watching your every flinch. Because nothing in the Roman bathhouse was private. Not even pain. The first order of business, shaving. Beards were a statement. In the early Republic, they were trimmed short, signalling discipline. Later, emperors made beards fashionable again, which meant every Roman had to follow suit or risk looking outdated. But styles changed as quickly as emperors fell, so the tonsor's bench was always full. The razors? Bronze, iron if you were lucky, sharpened only enough to make them dangerous. A clean shave was rare. A cut was common. Infection was almost guaranteed. But you sat there, stoic, while the blade dragged across your skin, taking not just stubble, but often blood. The tonsor didn't apologize. He might even laugh. The audience certainly did. And if you had a wart, a mole, or an unsightly spot, congratulations, you'd just signed up for Roman dermatology. Out came the tweezers, or worse, the scalpel. A quick slice, a dab of vinegar, maybe a burning coal pressed to the wound for healing. You'd walk away lighter, yes, but not just in blemishes, sometimes in blood. Criticism is easy here. This was called care. The Romans genuinely believed they were improving themselves, polishing themselves for society. Yet by our standards, this was little more than communal torture disguised as hygiene. Pain wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was part of the ritual. A man who endured it silently showed virtue. A man who flinched showed weakness. So the bathhouse didn't just test your skin, it tested your soul. or at least your ability to keep your mouth shut while someone sliced off your corns. And corns. Let's talk about them. Roman footwear was unforgiving. Sandals offered little protection. Marching across stone streets meant calluses, cracked heels, and corns so thick they could be mistaken for extra toes. Enter the pumice stone, rough, volcanic, and shared. The tonsor would scrape at your feet until the hard skin peeled off like bark, leaving raw flesh beneath. It stung. It bled. But the crowd nodded approvingly. You were respectable again. Gaius hated this part most of all. He could endure the strigel, even the smell of Titus's overpowering perfumes. But the tonsor's bench? That was humiliation incarnate. He sat with his sandals off, exposing cracked heels, while the barber scraped and muttered about neglect. Men nearby chuckled. One whispered, "Doesn't take care of himself." As if Gaius's entire worth could be measured by the state of his feet, which, in Rome, it could. Meanwhile, Titus strutted in, reclining like a king, his nails already gleaming from a previous visit. The tonsor trimmed them delicately, shaped them even, while Titus told stories about his exploits in the forum. None were true. All were believed. Because when you looked the part, you didn't need the truth. And women? Their grooming was even harsher. Livia, enduring yet another morning of lime-based depilatory paste, sat stoically as her cosmetai plucked stray hairs with tweezers sharp enough to double as surgical tools. Her legs burned, her arms reddened, her face was powdered pale with lead. She could barely breathe under the weight of the chemicals. But in the eyes of her peers, she was radiant. Pain equaled virtue. Virtue equaled beauty. Beauty equaled survival. The tools themselves deserve mention. Shared razors, shared pumice stones, shared tweezers, none washed properly, all passed from man to man, woman to woman. The bathhouse was a library of germs, and the tonsor was the librarian handing out infections like scrolls. Tetanus, sepsis, blood poisoning. They all lingered in these tools, yet no one blamed the barber. They blamed fate, or the gods, or, occasionally, the victim himself for being weak. It's almost darkly funny. The Romans engineered aqueducts, bridges, and sewage systems that still impress us today, yet they couldn't be bothered to rinse a razor. Civilization indeed. Beyond the pain and the risk, grooming was about politics. The man who sat stoically through a bloody shave proved his discipline. The one who sneered at another's corns proved his superiority. Even here, in the corner of the bathhouse, status was at stake. You weren't just having a mole removed, you were auditioning for respect. And through it all, Felix's fire roared below, heating the floors as blood dripped from razors and pumice dust fell between the tiles. He heard the muffled laughter, the gasps, the cries. He never saw the faces, but he understood something the bathers never would. The line between grooming and punishment was razor thin, sometimes literally. So the tonsor's bench became another stage in Rome's endless performance. A place where pain was paraded, cleanliness performed, and dignity chipped away with pumice dust. And yet they returned, every day. Because to skip the tonsor was to slip from society's gaze. Better to bleed in public and fade in obscurity. If your skin was scraped raw and your feet bled from pumice, you might think the ordeal was over. But in the Roman bathhouse, grooming extended further. It wasn't just about clean skin and trimmed nails. It was about every visible part of you being made acceptable to society, whether that meant plucking, polishing, or outright butchering. The bathhouse was many things: a spa, a forum, a gossip chamber, and, disturbingly, a clinic. And not the good kind. There was no sterile white robe, no steady hand guided by medical ethics. There was a tonsor with a blunt razor, a cosmetic slave with vinegar-soaked cloth, and a crowd ready to laugh when you screamed. Let's begin with teeth. Roman dentistry was a horror show. Teeth matted smiling was a social act, and bad breath was a crime against civility. If your breath stank, you weren't just unhealthy, you were immoral. People believed foul odour rose from a corrupt soul. And so, desperate measures were taken. Charcoal was rubbed on gums to whiten teeth. Crushed bones and oyster shells were ground into powders to scrub away stains. It worked, sort of, until your enamel wore down and your teeth shattered. And when they did, the solution wasn't root canals, it was extraction. With pliers. In public. Yes, in public. Imagine sitting on the bench while the tonsor yanked a molar with iron tongs, no anaesthetic, the tooth snapping audibly, the socket bleeding freely. Men watched, pretending not to wince, as if stoicism were a shield against agony. And afterward, a rinse of vinegar, a muttered prayer, and back into the steam. You weren't better. You were maimed. But you were presentable again. And if you couldn't afford the tonsil's crude dentistry, you turned to folk remedies. Powdered mouse brains mixed with honey, applied to gums. Ashes of burnt hair. Yes, hair. Rome didn't lack imagination. It lacked hygiene. Now let's move up the face. The nose, a prominent feature in Roman beauty standards, was a common source of ridicule. Too hooked, too flat, too wide, too anything, and you were mocked mercilessly. Enter the world of Roman cosmetic surgery. Not surgery as we know it. There were no skilled hands reconstructing cartilage under anesthesia, but brutal improvisations. Broken noses were reset with splints made of linen and resin, often in the bathhouse itself. It wasn't about health, it was about hiding weakness. A bent nose meant you'd been hit. A straight one meant you'd survived. The ears, too, weren't safe. Wrestlers and soldiers often suffered cauliflower ear, swollen, misshapen, grotesque. The cure? Slice it open with a knife, drain the fluid, and bind it tight. Again, often in public, often with spectators. The bathhouse, after all, wasn't private. It was theatre, and theatre demanded suffering. Even scars were treated. Some scars were badges of honour. Wounds on the front of the body showed bravery in battle. Wounds on the back, however, screamed cowardice. A scarred back could ruin your reputation. So some men sought to soften these scars by rubbing pumice stones across them until they bled anew, hoping fresh wounds would heal prettier. This wasn't medicine, this was desperation. And then there were the eyes. Romans prized brightness. Dull eyes suggested illness or drunkenness. So women, desperate to look radiant, dripped drops of belladonna into their pupils. Yes, belladonna, the same toxic plant that can stop a heart. It widened their pupils, made their eyes glow. It also slowly blinded them. But fashion waits for no one, not even sight. Livia endured much of this. Her cosmetics chest was full. Lead powder for skin, belladonna drops for eyes, vinegar for breath, and pumice for calluses. She hated it. It hurt. But she endured. Because in Rome, to not endure was to lose your place. And a woman who lost her place had little left to lose. The criticism here is unavoidable. This was a society that conquered empires yet couldn't conquer its own vanity. Rome invented concrete, arches, aqueduct structures that lasted millennia. And yet its people destroyed their bodies with daily rituals so toxic they shortened their lives. Civilization built monuments that endured while its citizens crumbled. And perhaps that is the most Roman irony of all. They built greatness outside themselves and ruin inside themselves. They engineered permanence in stone and fragility in flesh, and they called it progress. Gaius, enduring another bloody shave, knew none of this. He only knew that if he skipped the tonsil, people would whisper. If he let his nails grow too long, his boss would sneer. If his breath soured, his friends would vanish. So he sat still while the razor nicked his jaw, while pumice scraped his heel raw, while vinegar burned the fresh cut. He wasn't cleaner, he was conforming. Titus, naturally, thrived. He laughed through it, even joked when his mole was sliced off and bled onto the bench. His pain was performance, proof of toughness. Men admired him for it. He admired himself even more. He would leave gleaming, polished, dangerous. Not because he was healthier, but because he looked untouchable. Felix, deep in the furnace room, knew nothing of these rituals. But he understood the cruelty. He too was forced to bleed, to burn, to suffer, not for health but for appearances. The appearance of Rome's power, Rome's order, Rome's false civility. So the bathhouse grooming rituals continued, day after day. Teeth shattered, noses splintered, eyes poisoned, faces powdered. Pain endured. And all of it under the illusion of improvement. Rome didn't invent beauty. It invented torture, disguised as beauty. And the world applauded, noses bleeding, eyes watering, teeth missing, still convinced they looked divine. Chapter 7. Voyeurism and the Male Gaze. The bathhouse was a place of stone, water and fire, but it was also a place of eyes. Hundreds of them. Watching, scanning, appraising. You couldn't walk through the appraising without being measured. Not just for your rank, but for your body, your skin, your scars, your youth. And once you stepped into the mist of the caldarium or plunged into the cold clarity of the frigidarium, there was no hiding. Romans didn't believe in privacy here. Privacy was weakness. The bathhouse was spectacle. Everybody became public property the moment it undressed. Your neighbours saw you, strangers saw you. Potential rivals, allies, lovers, enemies. Everyone stared, and no one pretended not to. For some, this was opportunity. A chance to show off toned muscles, sculpted by hours not at war, but at the gymnasium. A chance to flash a new scar and invent a glorious story behind it. A chance to attract admiration, or at least envy, with the gleam of perfumed oil. Titus thrived here, strutting through steam like it was his stage. He wanted the eyes. He craved them. His entire identity was woven from what those eyes reflected back. But for others, like Gaius, the eyes were a threat. He walked quickly, hunched slightly, trying to become invisible in a room where invisibility was impossible. He hated the scrutiny, the way men glanced at his thinning hair, his unremarkable frame, his slightly crooked shoulder. He felt smaller with every glance, like the very air pressed him down. In Rome, being unnoticed was a form of survival. Being noticed for the wrong reason was a sentence. And yet, the gaze didn't stop at judgment. It slid into desire, into voyeurism, into predation. The bathhouse was famous for gossip, yes, but also infamous for what happened beneath the water, in the shadows, in the corners where attendants looked away. Young boys, sent as assistants, were watched too closely. Women, allowed in at certain hours, were ogled, whispered about, even harassed. Rome celebrated the body, but also exploited it, and the bathhouse was its perfect hunting ground. The erotic murals and statues that adorned some bathhouses didn't help. They blurred the line between art and invitation, turning every room into a suggestive backdrop. A reclining Venus here, an aroused satyr there, a fresco of lovers in the changing room. It was a silent cue that desire belonged in the baths as much as steam and water did. And so it flourished, often without consent, hidden beneath the same rituals of cleanliness and community. Criticism practically rises with the steam. Rome congratulated itself for civility, for discipline, for order, and yet its temples of hygiene doubled as theatres of exploitation. They claimed the baths united citizens, but in reality they exposed them. To disease, yes, but also to abuse. Power was naked here, literally. The man who controlled the gaze controlled the game. And those without power? They endured. Even among men of equal status, the gaze was weaponized. To stare too long at another man's body could brand you as effeminate, suspect, Greek. To avert your eyes too quickly could brand you as timid. The balance was absurd, impossible, cruel. Your body was both your shield and your vulnerability, and every glance carried meaning. Livia, navigating her own bath hours, knew this well. Women weren't spared from scrutiny, they were magnified under it. Every wrinkle, every sag, every blemish was noted and filed away for social commentary later. A woman's virtue was measured as much by her skin as by her reputation. If she looked too polished, she was indulgent. Too plain, she was lazy. The gaze never relented, and it never forgave. And here's the bitter irony. The Romans believed this constant exposure built unity, even trust. If everyone saw everyone, then secrets dissolved, honesty prevailed. But the opposite was true. The bathhouse didn't build unity. It built paranoia. Every man was on display, every woman judged, every child vulnerable. The gaze didn't bind them together. It tore at them silently, like water wearing down stone. Back to Gaius. He sits in the tepidarium, pretending not to notice the eyes sliding his way. He knows he isn't handsome, but he also knows appearances matter more than truth. So he stretches slightly, fakes a yawn, tries to mimic Titus's ease. Does it work? Of course not. The attempt itself is noticed. A smirk, a chuckle from across the bench. He shrinks again. Rome's greatest cruelty wasn't war or conquest. It was how it turned daily life into performance, how it demanded masks even when you were naked. Meanwhile, Titus thrives, flexing as he plunges into the frigidarium, enduring the shock without a gasp. Men nod approvingly. Some admire openly. He knows it. He basks in it. Titus doesn't fear the gaze. He feeds it. He becomes stronger with every look. But strength built on admiration is fragile, and Titus doesn't see that, not yet. Felix, of course, has no gaze. He is unseen. No one watches the man in the furnace room unless he falters. His nakedness is not displayed but consumed by smoke and shadow. He is both invisible and indispensable. Perhaps the cruelest fate of all. So the gaze ruled the bathhouse, shaping reputations, bending virtue, feeding desire, hiding cruelty. Rome called it community. We might call it surveillance. And in the steam, in the shadows, under the flickering lamplight, it was everywhere. The bathhouse wasn't a place to relax. It was a place to be watched, to be measured, to be judged. And in that gaze, Rome revealed itself, not clean, not virtuous, not united, but obsessed with performance, blind to the rot beneath the skin. If segment 1 showed us how every bather was constantly measured by the gaze, then segment 2 brings us to its sharpest edge. What happened when looking turned into exploitation, when curiosity curdled into scandal, and when the bathhouse's promise of equality collapsed into a very Roman kind of cruelty. For all its marble and mosaics, the bathhouse was built on cracks, and into those cracks flowed rumours, seductions, and accusations. The very design of the place encouraged it. Steam blurred vision, making every glance uncertain, every shape suspicious. Shadows danced against walls, turning gestures into whispers, whispers into insinuations. You never quite knew who was watching you, who overheard your words, or who might twist them into something scandalous by the next morning. Take the case of Marcus Aquilius, a real senator from the late Republic, remembered less for legislation and more for whispers that began in a bathhouse. He was said to spend too much time watching the young attendants, his gaze lingering too long. Was it true? Who knows? What mattered is that men talked. Jokes were told. Before long, Marcus's reputation was less about politics and more about perversion. He wasn't convicted of anything, but he lost influence. In Rome, accusation was as powerful as evidence, and the bathhouse was the birthplace of accusation. Gaius knew this instinctively. He kept his eyes down, not from modesty, but from fear. To glance too long at a senator's body could be read as mockery, or worse, desire. To look away too quickly could be read as guilt. In this impossible game, neutrality didn't exist. Every second was interpreted, analysed, filed away in someone's memory. Meanwhile, Titus courted the gaze like a gladiator courts applause. He flexed at the edge of the frigidarium, dove with dramatic splash, resurfaced with water sliding perfectly down his shoulders. Men chuckled. Women, when present, giggled behind hands. But Titus's brilliance blinded him. He believed admiration was power. He forgot how quickly admiration could sour into envy. And envy was poison in Rome. And let's not ignore women's side of this gaze. Livia endured her bathing hours like battle. Every eye on her was an audit. Was her perfume too heavy? Was her skin too pale? Her cheeks too flushed? One wrinkle, one blemish, could become dinner gossip. Even worse, men sometimes bribed attendants for access to ladies' hours, peering through curtains or sneaking glances through poorly guarded doors. What Rome called sophistication often masked voyeurism. What it called culture often hid coercion. The murals didn't help. Erotic frescoes on bathhouse walls were public art, but they weren't subtle. Satyrs chasing nymphs, gods seducing mortals, lovers entwined. Children grew up seeing these images daily, absorbing the message that desire was part of bathing, that the gaze wasn't just normal but divine. What began as art ended as license. Criticism here is obvious but necessary. Rome prided itself on discipline, on self-control, on the stoic virtues of restraint. Yet its most celebrated social institution blurred the line between civility and indulgence so thoroughly that exploitation became background noise. It wasn't questioned. It was shrugged at, joked about, normalized. And that normalization left scars not just on individuals but on the society itself. Scandals spread from these walls like smoke. A senator rumoured to have ogled too long. A merchant accused of bribing attendants for access to women's rooms. A soldier caught boasting too loudly of what he'd done beneath the water. Many of these stories were exaggerated, some outright lies. But that hardly mattered. Rome didn't require truth to destroy a man. It required a whisper in the right place, and the bathhouse was nothing if not a factory of whispers. The performance of nudity also carried political weight. To look too frail was to invite mockery. To look too strong was to invite suspicion. Rome feared imbalance. A senator with bulging muscles looked like a gladiator. Too much vigour suggested ambition. Too much softness suggested corruption. The body was never just flesh. It was a metaphor. And metaphors could kill. Apollonius, our insufferable poet, loved this theatre. He thrived on half-truths. The eagle flies too close to the sun, he would mutter loudly after watching Titus pose. Everyone laughed. Titus smiled too, pretending not to notice. But later, someone repeated the line outside the baths. Then in the forum. Soon, Titus's name was tied to arrogance, hubris, danger. Did it ruin him? Not immediately. But reputations in Rome eroded slowly, like marble underwater, until one day they collapsed. Even the architecture betrayed the gaze. Raised benches meant those who entered later were forced to pass in front of others, every scar, every limp on display. Pools reflected bodies, doubling the exposure. Steam clouded edges but never hid the centre. The bathhouse wasn't designed for privacy, it was designed for scrutiny, and scrutiny breeds scandal. And beneath all of this, Felix remained unseen. He fed the furnace, coughed into the smoke, and heard muffled laughter echoing through stone. No one looked at him. No one gossiped about him. His anonymity was both curse and shield. He would die unknown, but he would never be destroyed by the gaze. Perhaps, in that small way, he was freer than the men above. So the gaze lingered long after bodies dried and perfumes faded. It lingered in whispers, in reputations, in political manoeuvrings born from a smirk in the steam. Rome thought its baths made men equal. Instead, they made them vulnerable. Equal only in the sense that everyone could be watched, everyone could be judged, and everyone, senator or slave, merchant or poet, could be destroyed by a look. The bathhouse wasn't just about nudity. It was about exposure. And exposure, in Rome, was as dangerous as any blade. In Chapter 8, we'll leave the politics of looking and dive into the far more brutal reality of what those steamy rooms spread, infections, parasites, and the silent killers that made the bathhouse less a sanctuary of health than a slow-motion execution chamber. Chapter 8, The Disease You Soaked In. For all its marble splendour, golden statues, and perfumed steam, the Roman bathhouse was less a temple of health than a cathedral of contagion. The irony is almost unbearable. Here was a society that built aqueducts spanning mountains, invented plumbing systems that still amaze us, and yet managed to turn its most celebrated social ritual into one of the deadliest. Step into the frigidarium, the cold plunge, and you're not just stepping into water. You're stepping into a living broth of bacteria, fungi, and parasites. The pool wasn't drained daily, not weekly, sometimes not for months. Water circulated in and out sluggishly, more symbolic than cleansing. The oils, perfumes, and sweat shed from hundreds of bodies floated on its surface, forming a rainbow film that shimmered in torchlight. Beautiful, yes. But beauty in Rome often hid something rancid. The Romans didn't know about microbes, of course. They spoke of miasma, foul airs rising from corruption, but they weren't completely wrong. Bad air did kill, just not for the reasons they thought. In truth, the killer wasn't just the air. It was the water itself. Every pore you opened in that steam-filled room became a doorway, and what walked through that doorway was disease. Let's start with tuberculosis. The Roman cough. It echoed through the caldarium like a chorus, deep, wet, rattling. The warm, humid environment was perfect for spreading it. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing in each other's damp exhalations. Every laugh, every sigh, every gasp in the cold plunge carried invisible death. You could walk in healthy and leave marked for life. But because Rome equated a glowing, perfumed exterior with health, nobody questioned it. Then there were skin infections, ringworm, scabies, boils, fungal rashes that bloomed beneath tunics and spread with every shared strigel, pumice stone, and towel. The bathhouse was a laboratory without sterilization, a factory line of infection disguised as grooming. And because appearance mattered more than truth, men covered sores with oil and women powdered blemishes with lead. They looked radiant, even as their bodies rotted. And let's not forget the eyes. Conjunctivitis, pink eye to us, ran rampant. Imagine wiping your face with a communal towel soaked in oil and sweat from 10 strangers. Your eyes burned, your lids swelled, your vision blurred. Romans called it a minor irritation. We would call it an epidemic. The gut, too, was under siege. The same attendants who scrubbed benches also cleaned latrines. Without soap, without barriers, their hands carried more than water buckets. Parasites thrived. Pinworms, tapeworms, roundworms, all passed invisibly through unwashed fingers, oily hands, contaminated water. And when Romans fell sick, they blamed the gods, or the stars. Never the bathhouse. Even worse were the sexually transmitted infections. Romans didn't classify them the way we do. A sore on the groin? Venus's punishment. A rash in the thighs? The wrath of Bacchus. But call it what you will, the reality was the same. The baths were petri dishes for syphilitic sores, gonorrheal discharges, and fungal infections that spread faster than any rumour in the forum. Perfume masked the smell, oils masked the look, but the rot spread beneath. Livia suffered quietly from this culture of denial. Her lead-based face powder gave her that marble glow, yes, but it also thinned her hair and weakened her bones. Her depilatory pastes burned her skin. She left the bathhouse pale, perfumed and praised. But at night she coughed into her sheets, her lungs rattling with the same Roman cough that echoed in every steam-filled hall. Her neighbours envied her beauty, None envied her lungs. And through it all, Titus thrived, or seemed to. He flexed in the caldarium, dove into the frigidarium, laughed with booming confidence. No one noticed the sore beneath his arm hidden by oil. No one questioned his rasping cough, disguised with bravado. In Rome, if you looked strong, you were strong. Reality was irrelevant. Criticism here comes easy. Rome celebrated its baths as the pinnacle of civilization, proof of superiority over barbarian tribes who bathed in rivers. And yet, those rivers, flowing and fresh, were probably safer than the stagnant pools of Rome. The so-called barbarians may have smelled of smoke, but the Romans reeked of denial. Civilization once again confused appearance with truth. And beneath them all, Felix coughed in the furnace room, his lungs blackened with soot. He was already dying, but at least he was spared the illusion. He knew his body was failing. He didn't perfume it. He didn't oil it. He didn't pretend. In some ways, the slave choking on smoke lived more honestly than the senators perfumed in saffron above him. So the bathhouse became not a sanctuary, but a trap, a place where disease didn't just linger, it thrived. And Romans, blind to the truth, kept returning, day after day, not because it made them healthier, but because it made them appear healthier. And appearance, in Rome, was worth more than life itself. The bathhouse wasn't just a place to scrape, soak, and gossip. It doubled as a clinic, or at least what passed for one. Rome prided itself on medicine, boasting physicians trained in the traditions of Greece, scrolls of Hippocrates, teachings of Galen, elaborate theories of humours and balance. And yet, once you actually sat on a stone bench wheezing with a fever, what you got wasn't healing. It was improvisation. Improvisation with sharp objects and herbs that smelled worse than the man applying them. The idea was simple. Health meant balance. Too much black bile, you were melancholy. Too much phlegm, you were sluggish. Too much blood, you were fevered. The cure? Remove the excess. Sometimes through sweat, sometimes through purging, often through blood. And where better to do this than the bathhouse, where bodies were already half naked and pores wide open. Picture Gaius, still coughing from yesterday's plunge. A physician, or rather a man claiming to be one, places a hand on his wrist, mutters about imbalance, and prescribes the obvious bloodletting. Out comes a small knife, the kind you wouldn't trust to cut bread, and with a quick slice to the elbow, Gaius's blood trickles onto the floor. A cloth dab, a nod, and the doctor assures him balance will return. Balance never does. But the audience around him nods approvingly. The man is taking charge of his health. Stoic. Roman. Never mind, he's just been weakened further in a room full of infection. And it wasn't just blood. Romans loved cupping. A treatment still practiced today in sanitized form, but in their case done with heated bronze cups slapped on the skin until bruises blossomed purple. The idea was to draw out impurities. In reality, it left men spotted, sore, and open to infection. But in a culture where marks of endurance were badges of virtue, the bruises themselves became proof you were serious about your health. For stomach ailments, the cure was even more absurd. Vomiting was considered cleansing. Wealthy Romans carried feather sticks to induce it after meals. In bathhouses, the more theatrical patients simply shoved fingers down their throats beside the pools, retching into buckets as others looked on approvingly. Clean inside, clean outside, they told themselves, more like malnourished and dehydrated. Women like Livia endured even stranger remedies. Infertility was blamed on a wandering womb, a belief so firmly held that treatments included sitting in scented steam rooms to lure the womb back into place. Perfumed smoke was wafted beneath her, oils massaged above, while attendants whispered encouragements. Did it work? Of course not, but the spectacle comforted husbands, and in Rome, comfort for men counted more than results for women. Eye problems were treated with concoctions of crushed ants, honey, and lead. Yes, lead. The same substance already poisoning their skin through cosmetics. Apply it to the eyes, and you'd at least look glossy if you didn't go blind first. Toothaches. Rub the ash of a burnt dog's head on your gums. Headaches? Tie a dead mole around your neck. Science, Roman style. Criticism practically drips from these treatments. This was a culture that engineered aqueducts stretching for miles, that aligned temples with celestial precision, that calculated eclipses, and yet thought a womb wandered like a lost sheep. They conquered continents, but couldn't conquer the common cold without stabbing veins or sniffing resin. Their medicine wasn't healing. It was theatre. And like everything in Rome, the audience mattered more than the outcome. And outcomes were grim. Tuberculosis killed slowly, turning men into shadows of themselves. Dysentery spread in waves, striking whole districts. Parasites gnawed at bellies, hollowing out children. Skin diseases festered, disguised with perfumes. Yet the baths remained crowded, every day, every evening, because admitting the truth that the baths themselves spread disease would unravel the entire social fabric. So denial was easier. Perfume was easier. Bloodletting was easier. Felix, deep in the furnace, saw none of this but felt it all the same. His cough worsened daily. No doctor came for him. No one balanced his humours. He was disposable heat. And in a twisted irony, his soot-blackened lungs probably spared him from some of the parasites that plagued the wealthy above. At least the smoke killed worms. A miserable form of protection, but protection nonetheless. Meanwhile, Titus strode proudly out of a cupping session, his back covered in swollen red circles. He wore them like medals, convinced the treatment made him stronger. Men clapped him on the back, pretending not to recoil at the smell of old blood and rancid oil. Titus smiled, certain of his vitality. Certain, as Romans always were, that appearance meant truth. Livia left the women's quarters pale, perfumed, her eyes stinging from belladonna drops. She coughed softly into her hand. No one noticed. They noticed her glow instead. Beauty, in Rome, was always just another form of illness waiting for applause. So the Bathhouse clinic continued, blending medicine and performance, pain and pride. Doctors sliced, slaves cleaned, poets gossiped, and through it all disease spread like steam, silent, invisible, inevitable. Rome believed it was cleansing itself. In reality, it was slowly drowning in its own denial. And that is the great irony. The bathhouse, symbol of civilization, was also its undoing, a monument to progress that quietly unmade the very bodies it claimed to perfect. Chapter 9, Politics, Plots and Assassination. It might surprise you that in ancient Rome, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a gladius or a catapult or a particularly aggressive speech in the Senate. It was a whispered sentence in the caldarium, or a friendly pat on the back near the frigidarium, or, if you were unlucky, a knife between the ribs while you soaked, unsuspecting, in lukewarm water. Because the bathhouse, beneath its polished mosaics and perfumed distractions, was also a crucible of politics. It wasn't designed to be. It just became one. When you gather hundreds of Rome's most ambitious men in one place, half-naked, sweating, off-guard, half-massaged and half-dehydrated, you don't just get body oil. You get scheming. You get strategy. And sometimes you get bodies that don't walk out. The idea that the bathhouse was an innocent social club is laughable. Sure, on the surface, it looked harmless. Senators and equestrians lounging side by side, joking, sharing wine, talking about the weather or whether Jupiter was angry again. But dig deeper, listen closer, and you'd hear the real business of Rome being done, quietly, casually, in the kind of coded language that sounds like friendship until it isn't. Take Gaius, now older, wiser, and just cautious enough to see it. He sits beside two younger men, pretending to enjoy the tepidarium. Their voices are low, but not low enough. He hears them talk of grain prices, of a shipping delay in Ostia, of a certain prefect who might be vulnerable. They aren't gossiping. They're calculating. That prefect's cousin is just a few benches away, wiping oil from his legs. He hears it too. He smiles, and files the words away like daggers in a sheath. This is how it worked. Rome wasn't governed in marble halls. It was governed here, in the sticky silence between steam clouds. Legislation was nudged forward not by oratory but by insinuation. Appointments were bought with smiles and handshakes over bowls of olives. Enemies were disarmed, not with swords, but with compliments laced in venom. The bathhouse was the Senate's shadow quieter, wetter, but no less sharp. And yes, people died. Quietly, sometimes. Other times, less so. In the year 91 BCE, a minor magistrate named Lucius Flaccus was found dead in the frigidarium. Drowned, they said. An accident, they said. But Flaccus had been about to expose a bribery ring tied to bathhouse renovations. Yes, bathhouse renovations worth more than some small provinces. His head hit the marble wrong, or so the official account claimed. No investigation followed. Just a fresh coat of paint and a moment of silence. Even Julius Caesar, yes, that one, was known to frequent the baths not just for health, but for reconnaissance. When you want to know who's loyal, who's wavering, who's already been bought, you don't summon them to court. You spot them shirtless, relaxed, laughing too loudly at your rival's joke. That's when you know. And then there were the secret messages, passed between slaves, whispered across benches, murmured during massages. Codes hidden in requests for oils. A glance. A pause. A name said too softly to be casual. It's hard to bug a room with no scrolls or scribes. But it's also hard to leave a room once you've been marked as dangerous. Titus, of course, plays this game like a seasoned actor. He flatters, he smirks, he offers opinions without ever quite choosing a side. He's learned to nod at everyone and commit to no one. It keeps him invited to the right benches, the right conversations, the right post-bath meals. He doesn't need to speak often. His body does enough talking. In Rome, appearances were half the argument. Criticism here isn't just warranted, it's overdue. Rome claimed it was a republic, later an empire of law, of structure, of order. And yet, the real gears turned in moist rooms where gossip mattered more than truth, where access mattered more than ethics. They bathed in public and governed in whispers. And if a man drowned while scrubbing his ankles, well better than stabbing him in the forum. Clean deaths didn't make political messes. Even the architecture encouraged intrigue. Narrow corridors, columns to hide behind, shadows cast by torchlight, pools deep enough to pull a man under with no one noticing until the bubbles stopped. A well-designed bathhouse wasn't just a place to relax. It was a place to plot. And architects knew it. And if a man was stabbed, it wouldn't be a wild fight. That was for poets and slaves. No, it would be a slip. A quiet grunt. A towel wrapped too tight around the throat. Slaves knew how to clean. Blood washed off marble easily. Rome had perfected the aesthetics of violence long before it legalized them. And beneath all this, Felix, of course, still coughing, still stoking, still invisible. If he heard secrets, he didn't repeat them, but he knew something even the politicians didn't. Fire doesn't care who it warms. The heat rose for everyone. And sometimes, when the timber was old and the politics too dry, everything caught. So the bathhouse wasn't just sweat and steam. It was smoke. From whispered threats. From egos set alight. From futures burned quietly before they even started. In Rome, you didn't need to assassinate a man in the forum. You could do it here. With a rumour. A laugh. A splash. Or just a little too much heat. In the harsh light of day, the Roman Senate pretended to hold the reins of the Republic. But anyone who had lingered long enough in the tepidarium knew better. It wasn't in the forum, but in the bathhouse where the real kingmakers flexed. Not their swords, not their scrolls, but their ability to listen quietly, smile strategically, and remember everything. It wasn't about who could speak loudest in public. It was about who whispered what, to whom, and when. You didn't climb the Roman ladder by being honest. You climbed it by being there, bare-chested, confident, unbothered, while your rivals boiled like overcooked lentils in the corner. Take Marcus Agrippa, right-hand man to Augustus. He didn't get there by accident. Agrippa knew the bathhouse wasn't for rinsing off after war. It was war. When Agrippa built new aqueducts and cleaned Rome's stagnant water supply, the Senate praised him. But it was the baths where his influence truly poured in. He funded new ones, grand ones, bathhouses bearing his name. And just like that, every steamy chamber became a campaign headquarters, a place where favours were offered, debts collected, futures aligned. He didn't need to shout about his power. It steamed off the walls. This was the genius of Roman political hygiene. Appear virtuous, clean, and friendly, but never be without strategy. The man who shook your hand in the caldarium might stab your vote in the back by morning, and it would be dressed up as diplomacy. Even the act of bathing together was political theatre. Shared vulnerability. Calculated openness. Show too little, you're hiding something. Show too much, you're weak. You had to strike the perfect temperature. Titus, ever the striver, understood this. He didn't speak in the bathhouse unless he had to, but he was always listening. Who was rising? Who was falling? Which merchant had been called in by which senator? Which general didn't show up this week, sick or simply cautious? Titus marked it all, like a scribe without a scroll. He smiled when spoken to, agreed when convenient, disagreed only when it would be admired. Meanwhile, Gaius, older and fading, realized something cruel. The bathhouse forgets fast. You can be the center of attention for a decade and invisible the next. Miss 2 weeks, and someone else has taken your bench, your conversation circle, even your oil slave. Status, like steam, vanishes quickly. He watched newer faces take the corners he once dominated, and knew the end of a political career didn't come with a retirement speech. It came with silence in the tepidarium. There was no mercy in Roman networking. It was a churn. The same man who toasted your promotion today would nod politely tomorrow while you begged for a military posting in the provinces, if you were lucky. If not, you might find your name quietly omitted from the next census. No trial, no scandal, just erasure. Steam made everything disappear. And Romans, masters of illusion, knew how to make that disappear look natural. Let's not romanticize this system, though. For all the grandeur, the columns, the mosaics, the marble, the reality was a greasy pile of human posturing. Rome celebrated merit, but rewarded manipulation. And the bathhouse wasn't an exception. It was the core. In a society where ambition outranked virtue, and loyalty was a mask adjusted depending on who entered the room, it's little wonder so much poison dripped through the steam. The client-patron system, often praised as the glue of Roman society, was just another soap-slippery contract. Patrons doled out access and favours in exchange for loyalty and public praise. In the baths, that dynamic played out in full view. A young client would wait patiently, half submerged, for his patron to arrive. When he did, flattery flowed as freely as oil. "Your speech yesterday was genius," he'd say, even if it had been a wheezing mess. "You've never looked stronger," he'd claim, ignoring the man's obvious gout. This wasn't sincerity. This was survival. Even the slaves, silent, oiled, ever-present, knew the game. They heard everything. And while most couldn't act on it, some did. A well-timed rumour, a misplaced towel, a comment repeated to the right ear, it could change the course of a career. There are quiet records of slaves being paid off for their ears, and there are louder silences of slaves who vanished after hearing too much. The real tragedy? The people outside these walls had no clue. They believed Rome was governed by law, by debate, by order. But Rome was governed by the wet bench where Lucius met Cassius. where a shoulder squeeze meant an alliance, where a nod in the frigidarium could delay a grain shipment and starve a town. All done casually. All done with clean skin and dirty motives. Livia, even as a woman, understood the currents. She couldn't participate directly, but she sent word through her husband, carefully fed opinions masked as concerns. She dressed him, briefed him, warned him of rival wives. The bathhouse was male terrain, but the war of influence was co-ed, and Livia played it with quiet ferocity. She couldn't sit in the steam, but she made sure what was said in it benefited her. And Felix? Still below. Still stoking the fires for men who barely noticed him. But sometimes, as he adjusted the flame, he overheard just enough to smirk. He knew what they didn't. Power built on steam is unstable. The hotter it gets, the faster it slips away. So when we look back at Roman politics and marvel at its collapse, let's be honest, it didn't fall because of barbarians. It cracked in the bathhouse. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, one sweaty compromise at a time. Chapter 10. Decline and Dregs. At some point the fire goes out. Not all at once, of course. That would be too clean, too cinematic. No. In true Roman fashion, the decline of the bathhouse came the same way as most of Rome's greatness faded. Slowly, with denial, patchwork repairs, and a parade of people insisting nothing was wrong, even as the plaster peeled and the marble cracked beneath their sandals. Imagine walking into a once great balneum sometime in the 4th century CE. It's still there, technically. The columns still hold, though they lean like old men with bad knees. The water still runs, but only sometimes, and only in the morning. The furnace is still burning, but not as fiercely. The slaves were sold last year. The ones left are skinny, angry, and doing twice the work for half the grain. The visitors are thinner too, and quieter. The laughter has faded. The politics, once whispered with wine and oil, are now drowned in Christian prayers or not spoken at all. The empire, by this point, is wheezing. Invaders nibble at its edges. Gold flows slower. Roads crack. And the bathhouse? It tries to pretend it's untouched, still noble, still necessary. But the truth steams through the cracks. These halls that once echoed with the voices of senators and poets now carry the coughs of aging bureaucrats and soldiers too broken to fight. It's not a place of community anymore. It's a shell, a habit. Like an old man insisting on shaving every morning, even though he hasn't seen anyone in years. One of the cruelest ironies of Roman civilization is that the bathhouse was both its symbol of sophistication and its canary in the coal mine. When the baths thrived, Rome thrived. When they started smelling like mildew and stale ambition, it meant rot deeper than the walls. The aqueducts weren't just plumbing, they were arteries. And as the Goths, Vandals, and Visigoths snipped them one by one, the heart of the city didn't bleed, it dehydrated. And here's where it gets awkwardly poetic. Christianity had risen, and it didn't much like what it saw in the steam. Nakedness, pride, men lounging together discussing who to bribe and who to betray. No, thank you. The new empire. One of humility, penance, and the occasional saintly guilt trip, had little patience for rooms full of sweaty, philosophical, half-naked power brokers. Slowly but surely, public bathing began to seem suspicious, maybe even sinful. Criticism of the bathhouse wasn't just spiritual, though. It was practical. What once seemed like the hallmark of hygiene began to look like a breeding ground for disease, for laziness, for distraction. And it didn't help that more and more people started dying after visiting one. Not dramatically, but suspiciously often. As maintenance declined, bacteria took the floor. And unlike senators, it didn't need a seat or a favour. It just needed damp. And Rome was full of damp. Some tried to fight the decline. There were local administrators who insisted on fixing pipes, raising taxes to fund repairs, conscripting workers to sweep mosaics. But the empire was no longer a place where local repairs could patch global rot. Provinces fell. The grain from Africa stopped. And without grain, the fire couldn't be fed. Without fire, there was no steam. Without steam, no purpose. And without purpose, the walls sagged like skin without bone. Even the architecture couldn't save them. Grand domes meant nothing when the lead lining rusted. Intricate plumbing meant little when the aqueduct feeding it had been torn down by a warlord who thought gods lived in wells. Some bathhouses were converted into stables, into churches, into housing for squatters. Others simply became ruins. Their once proud marble dragged off to build walls, villas, or, with bitter irony, newer churches that warned against earthly indulgence. Titus, now old and slower, still visited. Out of habit, perhaps. He'd sit in the tepidarium, alone most days, and remember. Remember when his life changed here. When alliances were born in steam. When Gaius still walked, when Felix still coughed below the floors, when the empire still had weight. Now the silence was thicker than the heat. And the walls, once gleaming, seemed to sweat failure. What happened to the knowledge? The engineering? The discipline that once made these places marvels? It evaporated, much like everything else Rome touched. The generations that followed would build spas, yes, and baths too. But the science, the flow, the civic purpose, gone. We romanticize Rome today for its luxury, its grandeur, its baths. But Rome couldn't even hold on to those. Let's be blunt, for all the Republic's pomposity, all the Empire's grand declarations, they couldn't keep their pipes clean. Their systems were too centralized, too dependent on a fragile network of slaves, taxes, and blind faith in eternity. And eternity, as it turns out, has a bad sense of humor. Gaius never lived to see the fall. Felix did, just barely. He died beneath a bathhouse still half-functioning, still pretending. The last steam he fed into the room didn't warm statesmen or inspire debates. It just fogged the cracked dome above, then vanished. Rome didn't fall in a day. But the bathhouse showed us exactly how it would. Slow decay. Denial. Decoration over structure. And the belief that as long as the water stayed warm, everything was fine. In the next and final segment, we'll step beyond the ruins and look at what the Roman bathhouse truly left behind. Its influence, its echoes, and the way even today your spa day owes more to Felix's furnace than any modern pipe. So here we are. The steam has thinned, the embers are cold, Rome has crumbled, not with a scream, but with a shrug, and yet somehow the bathhouse persists, not in marble, not in empire, but in memory, design, and oddly enough, in capitalism. Because if there's one thing modern civilization excels at, it's rebranding ancient decadence as wellness. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. When Rome fell, its bathhouses didn't vanish overnight. Some were torn down by invaders who mistook them for temples. Others were stripped for stone, copper pipes yanked like gold teeth from a corpse. A few survived long enough to become churches, because nothing says moral purity quite like baptizing the faithful, where senators once exfoliated their egos. But mostly they rotted quietly, becoming homes for moss, goats, and eventually archaeologists with tape measures and romantic ideas. And yet, the idea of the Roman bathhouse never quite died. It was simply too good, too seductive, too clean. After all, a society that managed to pipe hot water into giant communal rooms without electricity or a unionized plumber wasn't something to forget. Europe, during its long medieval nap, forgot how to make soap, but never entirely forgot how to bathe. Even when public washing became suspicious, thanks to a delightful cocktail of plague, nudity panic, and church guilt. The concept of bathing as a shared ritual stayed lodged in the cultural memory like a splinter. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find Renaissance thinkers digging through ruins and manuscripts, mumbling in Latin and whispering, "What if we did this?" Again? and thus began the slow revival. Only this time with rules, less nudity, more moralising. By the Victorian era, the public bathhouse had returned, minus the syphilitic poets and political assassinations. Now it was about sanitation, efficiency, productivity, cleanliness as godliness. It was less feed the empire's ego and more don't die of cholera before tea. But the Roman ghost lingered. You can see it in the architectural mimicry, the domes, the arches, the obsessive symmetry. You can hear it in the language, spa from salus per aquam. Even the obsessive modern ritual of gym's sauna shower smoothie owes more to Agrippa than to Apple Fitness Plus. We've traded togas for towels, oil slaves for eucalyptus-scented steam, and senators for start-up bros, but the behaviour? Uncannily familiar. Even the bathhouse's old sins have evolved. Back then, it was corruption, bribes, and ego battles. Now? Try overpriced memberships, detox pseudoscience, and branding campaigns that sell ancient Roman cleansing rituals for $2.99 a session. Once, you bathed to show your place in the Roman elite. Now, you Instagram your foot soak to signal self-care. Same performance, new platform. Let's take a moment, though, to give Rome its due. For all its blood, hypocrisy, and penchant for stabbing friends at dinner parties, it did pioneer a model of public infrastructure we still haven't matched. The baths were accessible. They were maintained, at least for a few centuries. They served rich and poor mostly, healed wounds, soothed stress, and yes, occasionally potted coups. But they were there, daily, functioning, civic. Which is more than we can say for a lot of public services today. The Romans understood something we pretend to forget, that people need places to be human together, to sweat, relax, argue, gossip, and float. To be reminded that beneath the politics, the armour, the dirt, they were just flesh. That insight was woven into every hypercaust and colonnade. And while their motives weren't pure, when are they ever? The result was, occasionally, something close to beautiful. Yet the modern world, in its eagerness to profit from the aesthetic, has skipped the substance. We've imported the mosaics, but not the intention. The marble, but not the maintenance. Today's wellness centres are private, exclusive, and dripping with synthetic lavender oil and class segregation. The Roman bathhouse was, ironically, more egalitarian than many of its modern counterparts. That's not progress. That's branding in a toga. And here's the final sting. We still haven't figured out how to maintain what we build. Just as Rome failed to preserve its own infrastructure, we watch our cities crumble under bureaucracy, apathy, and budget cuts. The lesson of the Roman bathhouse isn't just about bathing. It's about arrogance. About assuming that if something works now, it will work forever. The aqueducts will flow, the slaves will stoke, the senators will scheme, until they don't. Titus never returned to the bathhouse after that final winter. Gaius, long dead, existed only in the memory of crumbling stone. Felix, nameless in any real record, was buried under layers of soot and silence. But their world, bizarrely, echoes every time someone lights a scented candle and steps into steam hoping to find clarity, relief, or a slightly better version of themselves. We bathe today not to honour Rome, but to forget the noise for a while, to scrub away the day's filth, digital, mental, physical, in hope of emerging just a bit more bearable. That hope? That's Roman. That's what survived. So the next time you slide into a warm pool and think, luxury, remember you're echoing a tradition that once defined an empire. One built on stone, steam, and the thin, dangerous illusion that comfort meant control. It didn't. And that, dear listeners, is the end of our plunge. Thank you for staying through the steam, the scandal, the soap, and the sorrow. You've survived a journey through marble illusions and slippery truths. And as always, sleep well and question everything. Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived something most Romans didn't, a full day in their slippery, scandalous steam palaces. We've walked through marble echo chambers, sat with slaves beneath the furnace, eavesdropped on whispered bribes, and watched an empire slowly rot from the bath outward. But remember, this wasn't just a story about hygiene. It was a story about arrogance disguised as elegance, about control dressed in scented oils, and about how civilizations love to polish the marble while the foundation crumbles underneath. And maybe, just maybe, it's about how we still do the same, only with better lighting and Wi-Fi. If tonight's tale made you laugh, think, or just sleep a little smarter, consider sticking around. Here at The Drowsy Historian, we don't just tell you what happened, we show you why it still stinks under the perfume. So until next time, sleep well, stay curious, and never trust a man who offers you oil and politics in the same sentence.